Thank you all for being here at the inaugural Liberalism for the 21st Century Conference, convened by the Institute for the Study of Modern Authoritarianism, or ISMA. I'm Bernie Belvedere, Executive Director of ISMA and Senior Editor of its flagship publication, The Unpopulist. Glad you could join us for this breakout session on fighting misinformation without censorship. I want to say a few words about this session and then give the floor to the moderator to take it from there. The scourge of ubiquitous misinformation is here to stay. It's actually always been with us, of course, and technological advancements have always exacerbated it. The printing press, for example, helped illuminate the world. On net, it's obviously a monumentally positive development, but it also helps spread misinformation at scale. Again, that doesn't mean the technology isn't worth it. It just means we need to grapple with the challenges that it poses. The internet era, especially now with the advent of artificial intelligence, has similarly turbocharged the dissemination of falsehoods. As liberals, we are sternly opposed to censorship. The free flow of ideas, an intellectual commons populated by varied and even conflicting philosophies is absolutely paramount to uphold. So how do we battle misinformation without resorting to censorship? How do we combat it while preserving a robust commitment to freedom in society? It is my great privilege to introduce the moderator for this afternoon's session on fighting misinformation without censorship, as well as our esteemed panelists. The moderator is none other than Jonathan Rauch, Senior Fellow in the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institution. Rauch's articles and books have moved the needle in the right direction on so many topics of interest to liberals: gay marriage, government inefficiency, defending and upholding freedom of speech and expression, even the nature of happiness. Although he would never accept this description himself, he is in the running, as far as a lot of us are concerned, for most important liberal commentator of the past few decades. At The Unpopulist, we've had the unbelievable privilege of publishing articles of his, and it's a treat every time. His most recent piece with us, actually, is a book review of one of our panelists this morning. Please also welcome Renée DiResta, author of the newly released Invisible Rulers, The People Who Turn Lies into Reality. I personally can't wait to dig into that one myself. John actually had this to say about Renée's new book. Her book's strength is that it is about people, not technology. Those looking for a big villain, big government, big tech, or big brother will be disappointed. Instead, DiResta traces loosely coordinated networks of variously motivated manipulators, each reacting to and feeding others to create an emergent ecosystem of lies, half-truths, and conspiracy theories. Renée publishes tech policy essays in some of the most renowned outlets in the world. She also publishes academic papers and gives speeches on a variety of subjects at the intersection of internet safety, social media policy, technology, and democracy. We're so glad she's with us here today. Also on today's panel is Katie Harbath, Chief Global Affairs Officer at Duco Experts. Prior to her work there, Katie spent 10 years at Facebook, building and leading teams that managed elections. She also liaised with government and political figures, helping them figure out ways to leverage social media to connect with their constituents. Like Renée, Katie's work is situated at the intersection of democracy and technology. One point Katie made in a recent piece she published on her newsletter is that it's, quote, no longer enough for companies to say what they will do. People are increasingly asking them how they will do it. And she gives an excellent example that immediately resonated with me. At The Unpopulist, we're not just on X, we're also on Blue Sky, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, Substack Notes, and Threads. And the example Katie gave was about how Threads indicated a policy shift with respect to how they were going to treat, quote, political content moving forward, but they didn't specify, really to anyone's satisfaction, what exactly that meant. They didn't specify how they would classify political content, what would be the extent of their de-emphasis of it, right? They didn't say any of that. As Katie noted, people want platforms to show their work. So I'm really excited she's here to show hers. And last but not least, we have with us Berin Szóka, who is president of Tech Freedom. Prior to that, he was a senior fellow and the director of Center for Internet Freedom at the Progress and Freedom Foundation. There's a bit of a freedom trend in Berin's resume, which is just how we like it. It's just how we like it.
He chooses different words.
He's even had a stint clerking for a senior U.S. district judge in Oklahoma. I've learned a lot from Berin's coverage of the net neutrality discussion several years ago. Berin and his co-author, Ari Cohn, whom I'm also a fan of, said something important to our discussion today in response to a bad Wall Street Journal op-ed a while back. He said, "The storming of the U.S. Capitol should make clear once and for all why all major tech services ban hate speech, misinformation, and talk of violence. Words can have serious consequences." One of the op-ed's implications that he was responding to required coercing private companies to carry speech that is hateful or even dangerous. So Berin capably showed the problem with that. These questions about social media management, internet safety, combating the spread of misinformation without censorship, they're all interrelated. I'm so glad Berin is here to help us get clear on them. So on that note, I ask our moderator, Jonathan Rauch, to take it from here.
Well, thank you all for coming. Bernie, thank you for what must be the most gracious introduction I've ever received. I am mildly disappointed to be, however, only among the most influential liberals of the last 30 years. We'll have a conversation afterwards, and I will explain to you why I am far ahead of John Stuart Mill. I am a reluctant draftee into the information wars. I'm not someone who is deeply immersed in digital technology. I'm not someone who is engaged in social media. And it took me until about 2016, 17, 18 to wake up to the fact that we had major epistemic problems on our hands, many of them sourced to social media. So I am a draftee into this fight, and the panelists here next to me know far more about it than I do. So my role here will be suitably modest. Commodore Dalmia has instructed her moderators that we don't want opening statements. Do you all have that? Yep. No opening statements. Instead, we are to go directly into spirited conversation. I thought a way to do that would be to start with short general conversations on 3 topics. I will tell you what they are so that you can think about them as we discuss them, and they will create some groundwork for further conversation. The title of our panel is Fighting Misinformation Without Censorship. 3 active words, not counting the preposition. So we're going to talk first about each of them. Misinformation. Do we agree up here that misinformation or disinformation is an actual thing, or is it, for example, just a slur that the left uses against the right, or is it just a term indicating a disagreement in which you try to stigmatize the other side? So is misinformation and disinformation an actual thing? Number 2, do we agree that it needs to be fought? Is it, in fact, compatible with a liberal democracy, or are we hyperventilating about it? Should we just relax? And number 3, in the context of digital and social media, what do we mean by censorship? For example, do we mean takedowns, or do we mean disamplification? And whatever we mean by censorship, is it, in fact, a bad thing? Okay, so I am going to start with question 1. I'm going to ask for a volunteer. If I don't get one, it's going to be Renée on the spot. Do we think that misinformation and or disinformation is an actual thing?
Okay, I'll start. You don't have to. Yep. So I think it is something, but it has become politicized. So I believe it's both of the things that you did mention, and that has made this work a lot harder in which to do because of that politicization of it. It's also, when I talk to folks who've work a lot more in this space, oftentimes we will just combine mis and disinformation, and you're starting to see a lot of people just even move away from that framing and kind of talking about the broader information environment and what that looks like, because even defining particularly misinformation is quite hard because I think everybody would draw the lines in different spots if we were to give different examples here of what that might look like. So I think it's something important for us to think about and be talking about and be studying about what the information ecosystem looks like. But it is very hard, again, to use those words because people have politicized it both on the left and the right.
So it is a thing, but we no longer know how to talk about it. Renée, your thoughts?
My gripe with it is I've hated the word misinformation for a long time now, several years in fact, and that's because it misdiagnoses the problem as one of facts, right? It implies that what we are doing is disagreeing about facts. In some cases, we're disagreeing about facts because there are actually known knowns in the universe, right? And I think that part of liberalism means we have to be able to defend that statement that not everything is ambiguous, that not everything is a collectively constructed truth. Vaccines do not cause autism. That is not actually a thing that we should hesitate to say at this point. But one of the things that I think happens on social media is that things that are unknowable in the moment are categorized as misinformation. So I've been kind of beating the drum that propaganda and rumors are actually far better frames for discussing what we're actually seeing. And that's because you have politically motivated opinions, right? Information with an agenda, that is propaganda. It's a word we've had for centuries. And then rumors are things that are unknowable in the moment, right? This is a thing where we don't actually have an answer yet. Did COVID originate in a lab? We don't actually know, right? We didn't know 2 years ago. We don't know now. And so when you are talking about these things, implying that there is a known truth and we are going to disagree about it, the inability to agree on like what is a fact now is, I think, a far bigger problem than what is the fact. We're not having a discussion about the subject matter. We're having a discussion about the way of knowing itself.
So that's interesting. So the term has become so problematic that you would use these two more specific phrases for most cases. Presumably not everything is
right.
a rumor or propaganda.
Right. Again, there are the things that are knowable. There are the things where there's, long bodies of knowledge. The Earth, it is not flat, right? These sorts of things where we should be able to say this is a misstatement. This is something that is not true. But there are other areas, and I think the things that people focus on, particularly in the context of the social media conversation, is not the things that are known and established. It's the things where we're actually evaluating what to do about something, or what the social implications of an issue are, or what to do in that moment between knowing and not knowing.
That's such an interesting way to think about it. Yeah.
I think another thing as we're having this conversation today that is important to also think about is oftentimes when we have this conversation, we're just thinking about the content, what the thing says, what it depicts, what the image is, et cetera. And what we also need to be thinking about is who is posting it, the actor. So there's Camille Francois has a great framework, ABC framework, actor, behavior, content. And so all three of those things are also important to think about. And when studying this environment, and when you see a lot of platforms, for instance, taking down foreign interference, it's actually less not based on the content that they're posting, but the fact that the actors are portraying themselves as someone that they're not actually. And then are they the behavior? Are they spamming? Are they coordinating? Is it a bot? Stuff like that. So I think it's also important to kind of expand that out when we're having this conversation.
So Berin, any thoughts?
The previous panel noted the great Jewish tradition of responding to questions with questions. So I would ask why it matters.
And by the way, disagreeing with ourselves.
Oh, absolutely.
We have to do that as well.
Right. Well, one Jew, two opinions.
Yes,
right?
exactly. So you were saying.
So I think so. Why does it matter? So it is helpful to have some clarity as to what we're talking about. I think Renée's book does a very good job of offering clarity for the conversation. So I can't recommend it highly enough. It's
we all recommend Renée's incredible
and not only that you read it, but that your moms read it. I mean, it's actually, I think this is what she's done so well, is to write a book that is both compelling and effective for people who are in the room here today, but also people that that don't really understand what's going on online. And Renée tells many stories about real people to tease out and provide examples of media theory that is otherwise, I think, impenetrable. So that is a way in which it matters what terms we use, because we have a conversation about this as citizens. We have an ethical and a moral conversation. But as a lawyer, the question I'm interested in is, does it matter legally? And in the U.S., it would matter legally if we were writing laws about this, or alternatively, if we were trying to legalize or put into legalistic terms.
Before we get to policy, disinformation, misinformation, Are they for real? Are they on the level as concepts? I'm sorry to interrupt. Just want to make sure we hit that.
But my response to your question is, I think we have to be very careful about the tendency to take a hyper-legalistic approach to applying those terms in the context of content moderation, because I don't think we can operationalize them in the way that people expect when they hear clear definitions, right? So it's often said, well, the difference between misinformation and disinformation is intent, right? Disinformation, Renée can tell you this better than I can, but disinformation basically, as I understand it from reading Renée's book, is that you know that what you're saying is false, right? Now, in legal context, in some contexts, that matters very much. So in defamation context, that may indeed be one of the critical questions in a defamation suit. But I think, and Katie perhaps could speak to this, but I think that it is a problem that people expect when we start talking about these things, that we can operationalize concepts like this in a predictable, legalistic way and get predictable outcomes, when in fact the scale at which we are applying these concepts is so vast. We're talking about billions and billions of posts of content being posted literally every day, and decisions having to be made about them at a scale that means that we can't apply these concepts in a rigid way.
Is there a better way to define them? Would you switch to other concepts? Would you refine them?
Well, I'll give you a counter example, and then I'll answer your question. The counter example is in Europe, where they actually have put these concepts into law, right? The Digital Services Act is a way of dealing with these problems. The European Union, hilariously, has a code on disinformation that preceded the Digital Services Act. And the first thing as a lawyer that you're taught to do is to look at what the definition is. So what does the code cover? And the first footnote says disinformation includes misinformation and basically every other category. So in other words, they did not answer this question. They just dumped everything into this broad term and leave it to companies to sort out. So my answer to your question is, I don't want to have to answer the question. It's a real.
Did you say you're trained as a lawyer?
Yeah. Sorry, it's a real thing, and I think maybe the most important reason to have some clarity about it is because there is a political agenda that attempts to suggest that all of this is just a pretext for censoring speech that liberal elites don't like.
We'll come to that, but I'm going to go with we're 3-0 on this panel, that although misinformation and disinformation are a thing, the terms are no longer as useful as they once were, or as we would like them to be, and that they have been, as they say in academic world, problematized.
I agree with that. I will just add, these terms are not as new as they might seem. For example, I just finished reading Shogun, the great 1975 novel that's turned into that great TV series. And the term appears there. I mean, it's not a new thing that was just invented to talk about the internet. It's a term people have been using for quite some time.
Of course, propaganda, rumors, much older terms. Okay, question number 2. Do we agree that this thing, which we're not quite calling misinformation and disinformation as we once did, do we agree that whatever we mean by it needs to be fought? Is it inconsistent with liberal democracy?
Well, I would argue that we actually fought it as part of liberal democracy throughout history, right? The entire concept of the marketplace of, there we go, my mic's back on, sorry about that. The entire concept of the marketplace of ideas was that you would have something, we would determine what was factually true through a series of conversations. And is this me screwing up the mic or? Okay. And so that, again, that process of discussion and discovery was part and parcel to coming to consensus and, and moving forward, solving collective problems, determining how to respond or how to create policy.
All very disaggregated. Fought implies there's going to be a campaign. There's going to be a focused, coordinated effort to stop this thing.
Well, that I don't think works, right? I mean, that's sort of a chronic human condition. And that's where I think, again, the campaign against misinformation as a term does not make sense. The same way that I think you would say, like, we're going to fight against rumors. That doesn't really make sense. We're going to fight against propaganda. That maybe, depending on what time in history you're living in, makes sense. But the question then becomes how, of course. And I think right now, a lot of the campaigns perhaps should be around helping people to understand what it looks like in this information ecosystem, which we've also seen previously. We've seen efforts, counter-propaganda efforts, you can find them in various epochs in history, according to the information architecture of the day. This is how we think about it in the context of the Cold War. This is how we thought about it in World War II, World War I. You can see these efforts to make the public aware of the phenomenon or of the problem, so to speak, so that they themselves are empowered to respond within their communities, as opposed to some sort of top-down campaign against a concept, which I don't think works.
Well, and I think that's when you think about the word fought, what I was kind of thinking about is like it really depends by who we're talking about, because there are absolute campaigns, and Renée's at the middle of this, of where people are just putting out it's not what actually happened. They're misrepresenting what are in reports and stuff like that. And so whether it's Renée or others will be trying to be like, no, that is not what happened, and trying to fight against that. And so you will have people that are going to be doing campaigns. But I think that it's different if you're thinking about it from a tech company perspective or government perspective of, I don't think fought is the right term. I think, like Renée was saying, understanding and how to think thinking about amplification and more of the nuances around all of this, because I think it is absolutely right that if people are spreading lies and rumors about you, you should be able to fight back on that. But I don't think that others, like the government, should be stepping in to try to say you can't post this or that. And I'll get into more of the nuances later, but I think that's important.
So before we come to Berin, let me just push you on this a bit. I'm guessing there are a number of people at this conference who would say, look, preserving liberalism entails fighting disinformation. There are campaigns being waged against us by foreign and domestic adversaries who are attempting to overthrow the Constitution and the liberal order. And we have to wake up and no longer just count on the marketplace of ideas to sort it all out. Would you disagree with that?
No, I don't disagree with that at all. But I think the challenge of doing that is that assumes that it is very easily definable of what, and some of those things are, of what to potentially take down, and we can get into the remedies. And I think that's in one of your future questions around that. But what we're oftentimes seeing now too is foreign actors are amplifying or just pouring gasoline on stuff that's happening domestically. And so how you start to try to separate those things out start to get much more complicated. And then the other thing I would say too is I think it's absolutely appropriate that different organizations and groups and others should be thinking about how to be fighting disinformation and what that looks like. And then the question is, again, the how. What does that look like?
Okay, we'll come to how, but it sounds as if you're saying there is a goal here. There is a mission to be accomplished.
Yes, I think there's an understanding of what is actually happening, and then there's trying to figure out what are the actual levers that you should pull to fight it. Yeah.
Berin, any additional thoughts? Should we fight, quote unquote, misinformation and or disinformation, or whatever we decide to call it?
Jein, which is my favorite German compound word, which is a compound of yes and no. It's extremely useful. And so it depends what you mean. I mean, case by case, yeah, in many cases, for example, Dominion voting systems fought disinformation about their company. They took to court Alex Jones. They won the largest defamation lawsuit in U.S. history, and they put Alex Jones, hopefully, out of business. They were fighting disinformation. That was good. And I think everyone should celebrate that, both as a particular victory and as a demonstration that the defamation system in the United States can, in fact, function, at least in some circumstances. It depends what we mean, right? So if we mean, should we expect that there's ever going to be some point where we can achieve some sort of stasis where we don't have that problem? That's not going to happen, and it would be inconsistent with liberalism to expect that. I mean, liberalism fundamentally, and I just was rereading Edmund Fawcett's book, Liberalism. You know, he suggests that one of the four core essences of liberalism is an acceptance of conflict, that conflict is inevitable, and we can't suppress it. What we can do is try to structure it and channel it in better directions. And here, what's happening? Here, I would point you once again to Renée. Renée, you write very effectively about the marketplace of ideas image, and you suggest that that's not really the world that we're living in. How do you describe the digital environment, if not a marketplace of ideas?
One of the things that we talk.
Do we have another
Do we have
mic
a third one? If there's a backup, that'd be awesome.
Wasn't this a Marx Brothers routine?
That's the bad one here. So one of the, let me take on 2 points. One, in past periods, particularly around conflicts, the Cold War, the World Wars, you did see the US government intervening in counter-propaganda efforts, obviously both from the standpoint of counter-messaging, but also from the standpoint of creating educational capacity for the public to respond itself, right? And so a lot of times they were not in there getting in the weeds of the specific fact checks. They were saying, here is what this looks like and here is how you can think about it. This was what Active Measures Working Group did, for example, kind of, we are going to expose the operation. We are not going to sit here countering all of this point by point. More of a academic model, the Institute for Propaganda Analysis in the 1930s did the same thing by teaching people how to recognize rhetoric and tropes, particularly rhetoric and tropes indicative of fascism. This was during the time of Father Coughlin, the rise of fascism in Europe. And what you see there too is creating tools for empowerment, not playing whack-a-mole with the specific fact checks. The goal being that then you have empowered the members of the community to compete in the marketplace of ideas by giving them the skills to recognize it and then respond to it. So that's where I think you do have this two-level capacity of what the role of government is versus what the role of, educating the community so that the community can do that kind of response. Where social media is interesting and different, though, is that the structure of social networks assembled over a period from about the, people you may know algorithms in the early, people on Facebook remember, you originally had your own friends. You came there with your own friends. And then gradually, in order to increase your time on site, they wanted you to make new friends. And so you see a pivot from you having you engaging with people you actually know in real life around last night's party to, hey, you should go join this group over here. We're going to show you interests. We're going to build you an interest graph. And then you see the sort of siloing, the fragmentation around identity and alignment and a bunch of other criteria that an algorithm can use to shunt you into one community or another. And once you're in those networks, the prevalence of the content that you see reinforces the things that it keyed off of originally. So it's just a structurally different information environment. The marketplace of ideas implies that you have a diversity of perspectives and you're going to argue in the same space. The structure of social media does not lend itself to that, with the exception of, sorry, I know I'm going on too long, one platform, which is Twitter, which ironically then also incentivizes not so much discussion, but gladiatorial combat, if you will, where you're not trying to win somebody over and persuade them. You're trying to either intimidate them out of the conversation entirely by setting a mob after them, or you're just going to be, kind of antagonistic jerks going back and forth where resolution, yeah, exactly.
So my point in getting you to describe that better than I could was just to illustrate that those are all architectural choices that are made about shaping that environment. Larry Lessig famously said that code is law, that the code that shapes digital services really is the law that governs those services more than law created by the state. And that's, I think, the conversation that we should be having about how those services are structured. In the United States, and I'll just keep this short because we're not at the legal part of this yet, but in the United States, those are choices for private companies to make. Those are architectural decisions about the exercise of editorial judgment. Some of them might be business practices that could be regulated. Liberalism, of course, is not limited to the United States. In other areas of the world, they're making other decisions about how to deal with those.
So again, we will come to law and policy, and of course the point you just made is disputed, including by at least one Supreme Court justice. But remain... No?
I love your face. It's so great. I want that as a meme.
I'm a mean moderator. Before we get to policy and law and Europe, I do want to go to where we've been headed. It's the culmination of the point that you were all making, which is, okay, so censorship. What do we mean by censorship in this context? Is it the word we ought to be using for what we're talking about? So the topic says fighting misinformation without censorship. What is censorship in this context, and is it bad? And Berin, since I rudely cut you off, you're welcome to go first.
Okay, look, so I took 5 years of Latin and love the Roman world. And as you might know, the censor was one of the offices in the Roman Republic whose job it was to enforce morals. right? So that's what the censor did. It wasn't just suppressing speech. It was, it was like the moral police in Iran today. It was responsible for sanctioning people for moral violations. And he was exercising the authority of the republic. It was a public matter that was decided by the state. That's what censorship is. This word is now used by people, sometimes innocently. Sometimes people just use that to refer to their post was taken down. They think it was censored. That's a very sloppy way of thinking about a term that has a very particular meaning in the United States. And that meaning is did I turn this off? Is the government is responsible for taking down speech. Now, there might be circumstances when the government coerces private actors to take down speech, and that would be subject to the First Amendment. The problem is that the allegations that have been made thus far about censorship by private actors, no one has provided evidence that rises to that level. If they did, I would be open to that as being a First Amendment violation. And instead, this concept has been turned into essentially the idea that certain people have a right to use someone else's platform to speak, and they have a right to an audience. And that idea has become central to our culture wars, with one political party having embraced that concept after having opposed it for decades in the context of broadcast regulation, where they were against the fairness doctrine and now essentially want their own bizarro fairness doctrine for the internet, where they can say anything they want with no consequences, and any private company that tries to do anything about that is censoring them.
So even in principle, is there anything Facebook, a private company, could do that in your view would qualify as censorship?
By definition, yes, if the government were behind that decision. If they were coercing a private company to take down speech that the private company did not want to take down, that would be censorship. And that is something that can be done through a private company, and that happens in other countries. Yeah. I mean, the Indian government, just for example, we go to a long list of examples. The Russian government, I mean, that is a real problem around the world. I don't see any evidence yet that is happening in the United States. This was just litigated. The Supreme Court just decided a case about this called Murthy. The allegation was that merely by responding to the tech companies, when the tech companies asked the Surgeon General for examples of misinformation about COVID, that merely by responding to those questions, that essentially amounted to a form of coercion or an exercise of state power. And the Supreme Court said that that's not adequate, that you don't have standing to sue in those circumstances. And they left open the question of where the line gets drawn in the future, so we'll see.
And so if Mark Zuckerberg decided tomorrow that from now on his policy, which by the way he doesn't need to announce, is to take down anything that is pro-MAGA, that wouldn't be censorship?
By definition, no.
Katie, what do you think about this?
I agree. I think that it occurs to me that we're disagreeing with every word in the title of this panel, which I kind of enjoy.
We haven't gotten to with yet.
I know, that's true. But yeah, I think, censorship is another one of those terms that has become politicized and has become way too broad of the different things that mean of how different entities handle content on their sites, the different rights private entities have versus the government in terms of coercing and doing this and doing these types of things. And so I think we need to think about it much more broadly. And where we will probably take this conversation is also just thinking about content moderation in general, the amplification of content, labeling of content. There's so many different things now that are done and being decided on by companies that I don't think fit within the technical definition of censorship.
So Renée, on this, suppose someone says to you, well, the First Amendment lawyers are right. Technically, it's not censorship if Facebook decides not to publish opinions on one side of an issue or another. But let's face it, in the real world, there are only a small number of these very large platforms. It has the same social effect as censorship. It amounts to the same thing. we should call it censorship because in practice that's what it is. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, that's where the public conversation has gone. I don't think we're coming back from that, right? We can debate the legalistic nature of the term. I used to do that myself in 2018 when I would have these fights. Now I just say, okay, what we're actually talking about is people who feel that this is an affront to freedom of expression, even if they choose to use like phrases like freedom of speech, which have a legal connotation or a constitutional connotation. What they're upset about is a feeling that they are somehow not receiving the same right to expression as other people. And so, what I have generally tried to do, again, since around 2018, is just engage it on the values debate as opposed to the legal argument, which I think I agree with my two panelists that legally that's the wrong word. I've had a very interesting experience with this. I imagine, like many people know in this room, that I was declared the face of the censorship industrial complex in sworn testimony to Congress.
You personally?
I run a valiantly evolved.
As a secret CIA
correct
operative, ran the Global World Internet Censorship Bureau.
Yes.
Right here.
Yes, in the flesh. And what I thought was very interesting about it was because I have been outspoken on these issues for a very long time. The freedom of speech, not freedom of reach argument that we started advancing, me and Asa Raskin in 2018, was basically to make the argument that platforms should, in fact, continue to carry various types of speech that were being moderated, but that they didn't have to be promoted, that there was a difference, again, from an architectural standpoint, between allowing something to exist on a platform and proactively recommending it, or allowing a group to exist on a platform and accepting ad money from that group to promote their content. And so I saw that as the sort of, the dividing line, the differentiation between carrying speech and amplifying speech. And again, in the architecture of the day, that is the thing that most of these people are actually fighting about, right? That what they are actually looking for is not the right to have, it's not just that a platform carry their content, it's the platform amplify their content. There's a lot of ref working around that, particularly because what happens on social platforms, I imagine everybody in this room is at least somewhat aware, all content is curated, all content is ranked, all content is sorted in some way before you see it, which means you're not seeing a reverse chronological feed of all of your friends' posts. Interestingly, people personally experience that as censorship. When I would talk to people on Twitter in 2018, why do you think you're being censored? I would ask, because these are accounts with like 20 followers. Like, why do you think the platform has singled you out, person with 20 followers? And they would say, because my friends don't see all of my posts. And so that lack of understanding that curation and ranking and engagement-based metrics, that like the actual mechanics of social media were inscrutable to them, and they interpreted that lack of reach as censorship. This was then picked up by people who wanted to make that a winning issue, the propaganda campaign around censorship, in which, again, I argued for let it stay up and label it, let it stay up and throttle it in some cases. Labeling got redefined as censorship, fact-checking got redefined as censorship, throttling got redefined as censorship. And so it was like any sort of structural impediment or barrier to the reach they thought they were owed was redefined as censorship. And that's where that word has gone in the last 3 years, because it's very effective as a tool of power and as a tool to galvanize a base at this point.
So where we are apparently is that of the 3 active words in this title, all 3 of them have been politicized and problematized, made it harder for us to have this conversation and know what we're talking about. But it sounds like there is general consensus up here that there is something to be worried about that's happening online involving information, that measures do need to be taken in some ways to cope with it, but they shouldn't be heavy-handed top-down measures, and that the concept of censorship per se is no longer the kind of useful concept that it might have seemed to, say, First Amendment scholars 10 years ago. Am I sort of on the right track about sort of where we are? Okay, so maybe the next logical place to go is content moderation. And so that's another way of talking about it. It's, of course, not censorship necessarily to moderate content, but that too has been problematized. What are your feelings about the content moderation argument? What works, what doesn't work? Or do we have to give up on that too?
I like how both faces just immediately went over to me. Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of stuff for us to kind of unpack and kind of peel back the onions here. I think one thing first is when we're talking about this, there's the policies that platforms have. So what is or is not allowed on the platform. And again, that can be both the content, but it can also be the behavior that you might be experiencing. So a lot of times I know people would be like, Facebook censored me. They took down my content because I was talking about X, Y, and Z issue. And then we'd look into it and it's like, no, you were posting it in 100 groups over the period of 5 minutes. That's also known as spam. And so we were like, we actually took action because it was spammy behavior. And that's what the system saw. It wasn't necessarily about what you actually said. But so platforms have these policies that we can kind of talk about, how they try to define some of this stuff, et cetera. Then where I think the part of the conversation that oftentimes get lost is then how well these platforms can enforce those policies. And there it can become challenging because not only is it the amount of scale that's happening, it's the number of languages this is happening in. It is much easier to do this when it's text-based content versus video or audio. Is it being live streamed? And so many times people will be like, well, wait a second, Facebook has this policy that says X, Y, and Z is not allowed, but I'm finding it on the platform. Facebook thus is not enforcing their policies, where it's like, no, we just maybe didn't catch that one. Or there's a lot of borderline content that we'll talk about where, again, if I had showed some borderline stuff here in the room, I bet there'd be differing opinions about whether or not it violated a platform's policies or not. And one of the things I think platforms, we did a very bad job of in the early days was making it seem like we were 100% accurate when we had these policies and said, oh, we are not going to allow hate speech on our platform. We're not going to allow this. And didn't actually talk about the fact that being able to, the challenges that will happen in trying to find that and what that will look like. And then I think also as we've talked about this a little bit too, we've moved beyond the binary, leave it up or take it down conversation. That does still happen, but a lot more it is around how much amplification does it get? Does it get shown to people if you're following the account? Does it get shown to people if you're not following the account, but you're interested in that particular topic? Is it in a group format versus a page versus a personal profile? Can also be is a question that folks have. Again, the labels that like Renée was talking about that you saw a lot of platforms doing around 2020, both with COVID and election content, but now you're seeing them pull back on a lot of that because people were actually starting to get annoyed at how many labels were in their feed. And if you were to start labeling everything, your entire phone feed would just be labels of different stuff that people wanted to do. And then there's the question of even the efficacy. No, I'm not saying that word right. How effective those labels are. Does someone seeing something that doesn't have a label, does that then make them think it's either true or false? Do they just start skipping over that content? Things of that nature. And so we can go into a lot more of those details too, but I think that that's what's also complicated this conversation and this argument, and that what we were talking about in terms of even just defining censorship or what content moderation is.
Plus even throttling now is treated as censorship.
Yeah, and even that to that point too, one of the things we see, I remember that with this on Facebook, and you see it with any platform that has a feed-like system, is as more people and more businesses and stuff are getting on these platforms, there's a finite amount of content that any of us can consume in a day. And it always will get to a point where you could sit on that app all day, every day, and you still wouldn't be able to consume all the content that you're potentially eligible in which to see. And so the platforms had to start putting in the algorithms to try to show you the things they thought you were interested in. And a lot of people were like, wait a second, I'm not getting as much reach anymore. And they assumed it was Facebook purposely deciding not to show that to people. Sometimes that was, but sometimes too, it was also you're competing up against a lot more content. And so there's a lot more factors that are going into it of deciding whether or not somebody can see what you posted or not.
I was coming to you actually. Do you want to go, or should I ask the question that you're probably going to anyway, which is, so I'm your libertarian friend, and I say, look, Berin, why bother with trying to regulate what people say? Just let them say what they want to say. Let's have free speech. Is that where you're going?
Not exactly, but I'll get there.
Okay.
I think in some ways Renée is better qualified to answer that question. And the short answer is it doesn't work. I mean, the platforms would be unbearable Do you want to just answer that? Because you have a great description in your book about what the gladiatorial arena looks like and how we wouldn't tolerate in the real world people running down the street screaming after each other.
I am not a First Amendment scholar or a lawyer, to be clear, but one of the things I've been really kind of captivated by is the idea of time, place, and manner restrictions related to sort of civil unrest in city centers and places like that, and the idea that, you know, if you had hordes of people attacking the main character in your physical space, like in your city park, we would see that as like an extraordinary breach of norms, right? That would be seen for what it is, which is bullying, harassment, and attack. You can't chase your neighbor around with pitchforks or bullhorns or anything else. There are rules that we have in like meat space that don't necessarily translate well online, but in a sense, the effort to create norms, which is what a lot of the moderation rules are trying to do, is to engender particular types of norms. You have to have that, otherwise it becomes an unusable space. And that's the reality of it. And every single platform has confronted this and realized it at some point.
And if you were organizing a dinner party or if you were a bartender, you would just expel people for misbehaving. I mean, this is just not hard to see basic principles of decency and how we interact with each other. You have to have some effect online, and they can't be implemented exactly the same way. They have to be implemented at scale and quickly and imperfectly. So what I was going to say, back to Katie's point, what Katie described is what Mike Masnick at TechDirt has referred to as his Masnick's impossibility theorem, that it is impossible to moderate content at scale in a way that is consistent and predictable and, you know, essentially what I was referring to earlier as legalistically satisfying. It just can't be done. And I think a very large part of the problem in this debate is the expectation that it can be, the expectation that it will be perfect, it will be consistent, and if it's not, that's censorship and should be subject to some kind of legal remedy. The second thing I would point out here is the point that Renée made about the lack of understanding of how these services work is not new. I mean, that's true for any technology. Arthur C. Clarke, the great science fiction writer, called this Clarke's second law, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And while we might think about magic in, you know, Harry Potter, very positive terms, mostly magic is something people got burned at the stake for. Magic is a dark, unnatural force that throughout most of human history caused bad things to happen and caused people to, you know, to riot and to take out their vengeance on someone. And that's essentially what's happening with content moderation. People don't understand why it's necessary, how it works in general, how it works in a particular circumstance. And so they are very mad about it. And when someone tells them that they are being censored and there's a cabal behind it, and the cabal is being run out of San Francisco and they're people that don't share their values, or it's being run by CIA mom right here next to me, then, you know, they're going to go after her and try to shut her down and maybe show up at her house and threaten violence.
So there's a wonderful throwaway in your book, Renée. Is it Gateway Pundit or Instapundit? I can't remember. But one of these websites, which is all about internet free speech and conspiracy theories and all kinds of crazy shit, has terms of service. Infowars, thank you. Alex Jones has all the same trust and safety and behavioral constraints on its website that everyone else does.
And if I may, the only thing that I would have added to your book is not only do they have that, but all of those alt tech sites have it.
True Social, Gab, part of that, all of them have it.
And what's really remarkable is they're even vaguer. Yeah. They retain even more discretion. And some of them, and you note this, will go out of their way to say, well, you know, we're a private business and we get to make our own decisions. And if you don't like it, tough. I mean, that's how this works. And so the problem is not, it's not a problem, right? There is a problem of unaccountability here. And the response to that in the legal, theoretical, scholarly community is essentially what's called digital constitutionalism. It's this idea that there has to be some way of governing this private power. And there might not be state power. It's not the First Amendment in the United States. In Europe, the response might be legal in part. But there has to be some framework that governs the exercise of that power. I think the interesting question is, what does that framework look like? who are the other decision makers? How do you build in accountability? So our friend Kate Klonick, for example, embedded as a law professor inside Facebook and helped them develop what is now the oversight board, which provides a place, an outside place to go to raise questions about how a policy was implemented. And they are, sort of functioning as a kind of Supreme Court for Facebook and Meta as other services. That's one way to deal with the problem. Meta right now is experimenting with a different layer of the problem. So the oversight board is checking decisions after the fact. Meta is experimenting right now with involving community members in voting on or being consulted about changes to the policies up front. I mean, those are concrete ways in which you can bring more accountability to this process. And I think those are good things. But that's where we should be driving this conversation. And to return to your original question, we've been talking about users. We've been talking about people who are complaining about content moderation. We've been talking about the platforms themselves. We haven't talked about the other side of the market, which is advertisers. I mean, these services are private profit maximizing services whose business depends on advertising, except for X, which has driven all the advertisers away for the very simple reason that advertisers who are not Mike Lindell and MyPillow don't want their brands shown next to hate speech and people encouraging others to commit suicide, and you can go down the list of horrible things that are out there that would flood these services if it were not for content moderation. So that's why we need it, to answer your earlier question. Users don't want to see that content, and brands don't want their products shown next to that content, and they've taken principled positions to oppose that kind of content and have demanded that they want to be assured that their content's not going to show up next to that sort of material. So that's the sort of the mix of forces that are at work here. And you know what? From liberalism, from a liberal perspective, that's good. That's the market at work. You have civil society getting involved. You have economic forces getting involved. We find new ways to check power, and we iterate on that, right? That is liberalism at work. That's the opposite of what is currently happening with people who are trying to shut down the process of content moderation altogether.
We need to move to the audience, but before we do, let's push back on that point a little bit. It would be, I'll impersonate someone I'm not quite actually, but I'll do my best job. So it would be nice to live in a world where markets would solve this problem. And we'd have lots of things like intermediate layers, and people could choose their own filters, and we'd have lots of different communities, and just leave it alone. But that's not the world we live in. So this argument goes. So there's going to have to be more than that. There's going to have to be some sort of regulation. There's going to have to be some sort of guidelines, and it's going to have to be top down. And it doesn't need to look like Europe, but it should look like something else. Anyone have thoughts on that?
Well, this is where I like Lessig's framework that was brought up earlier. So not only there's the code layer of that, but he also does talk about the role for regulation, the role of markets, and then societal norms. And we're in the process right now, and we have been basically since 2016, of sort of redefining all of those and what that looks like. And we're still in the middle of that very process. And so you're going to need movement, I think, in all of those different areas. We can't rely on just one in which to actually solve the problem.
Should there be a bill, a law, a regulation, in your view?
My view is that where we should be moving this conversation is really around transparency, around not only what the platforms are doing, but what governments are doing, other things. And then the other is trying to make sure we're building in mechanisms for being able to build in checks and balances. Because nobody wants just the platforms in charge. Nobody wants just the governments in charge. Nobody wants any one single entity in charge. But we need to have ways to make sure that they can hold one another accountable for the decisions that they're making, and that we know what those things look like. And again, that's sort of what we're in the middle of the process of sort of building out.
So Renée, one of the wonderful things about your book is not only do you resist the temptation to have a big villain, you resist the temptation to have a big solution. I will tell the audience there's so much richness in the policy section of Renée's book, but it's not any one thing. It's lots of different layers of society. It involves everything from civic education to decentralizing platforms to more different forms of filters, greater transparency. We won't get into it all. Just buy the book and read it because it's the right way to think about it, which is a lot of different stuff by different actors. Instead, before we go to Q&A, I want to wrap up with the other dimension that is going on here. You have been in the bullseye of this. This is what's become known as anti-disinformation, which is targeted efforts by political actors using both social media itself and the government in the form of Congress and congressional oversight to target individuals and private organizations that are attempting to monitor, identify, and call out misinformation, disinformation, rumors, propaganda, whatever you want to call it. You have experienced this head on. I think it's fair to say that the organization that you helped to found and for which you work, the Stanford Internet Observatory, is either going out of business or through some kind of profound change that does not involve you as a result of this. What is happening with anti-disinformation, and is it going to make it all but impossible for platforms to continue to do whatever it is that they can do to push back and create a safe environment?
So for those who don't know, the subpoenas began to come down for Stanford Internet Observatory in March of last year. So Jim Jordan's Weaponization Committee, Dan Bishop's Homeland Security Committee, subpoenaed all of our communications with government, the executive branch, or with the tech platforms going back to 2015, except we started in 2019. So this was a whole thing. Lawyers negotiate these things, it turns out. The interesting dynamic there was that ostensibly this was to investigate this vast cabal by which the government was telling us to tell platforms to take things down. Now, there's been zero evidence found of that. So then this was when they started to, they kind of like move the goalposts when they don't find what they want. The investigations are now ongoing. I think Jordan sent another letter in response to SIO, the announcement that SIO was dissolving or refocusing. It's a little bit unclear even to me what's going to happen there. Basically reiterating that they were still under investigation and, he was still overseeing them. The piece of this that is interesting, though, is that so we were maybe the first to get the letter. I think we were the first to get the letter in the subpoena, but about 100 of these have gone out. This is a very, very broad, expansive campaign and broad, expansive witch hunt. And in addition to us, the platforms also got subpoenas. Or actually, I don't know 100% if they got subpoenaed. They had to come in for voluntary interviews. Their employees had to come in. What happens when you do a voluntary interview, for those who don't know, is they put you in a room with a video camera. They ask you questions for 7 hours. You don't get the transcript. You don't get the video. They do. You can potentially intuit what happens with those transcripts and those videos, which is they take 2 sentences out of them, and then they take the 2 sentences that they want, they recontextualize them, and they write these reports that are, completely not rooted in reality, very, very cherry-picked stuff.
Or leak them.
Or they leak, right, exactly. Or they leak selective excerpts with the intent to kind of send a mob after you. This is another thing that happens. For a university, this is a huge problem because most of the work that we did studying the election or the vaccine conversation for that matter was done by students, which means then you also have to, negotiate redactions and things like that because you don't want mobs coming after 20-year-olds. In addition to this, though, the lawfare then begins, and material that we turned over to Jordan under subpoena was turned over to Stephen Miller and America First Legal, who is suing us. Normally, in order to get documents, the lawyers have to fight and you go through discovery and so on and so forth. But when you use your subpoena power to obtain documents and then they wind up in the hands of the people suing you, that's something of an abrogation of norms, it turns out, though apparently not illegal. So the net effect of all of this is that it just creates an impression that, and the one thing that a lot of these actors have in common is that they were the actors who tried not to certify the 2020 election. I think it's very, very important to note that. The congressman doing the subpoenaing, the attorneys general doing the lawfare, Stephen Miller, and the sort of right-wing lawsuit mill machines, the one thing that they have in common was this effort to overturn the 2020 election or to not certify the 2020 election. And a lot of the reason to do this is because they consider it as positioning them in in the best possible way in 2024, because the teams that investigated false rumors and propaganda and election misinformation in 2020 are no longer doing that. And that was, it is incredibly advantageous to them. But now that this has worked, unfortunately, you're going to see it happen over and over and over again, in which any field that does any kind of work that is considered unpalatable for people who have gavel power in Congress are potentially going to find themselves in the hot seat the way that we have. The platforms, again, they've got employees to worry about. They also don't want to be in this situation. And so backing off to avoid being hauled in front of Congress constantly is a thing that has happened to them as well. So it is like imposed profound costs, both physical and financial. And I like read my own emails again last year. That was like, I wrote a book and I read my own emails. That was what I did as things went out for discovery. So the whole thing's surreal.
This is just one part of the lawfare involved here. So she's just described the war on research. There's also just been a war to bend the way that these services work, not only against content moderation, but also to steer curation in favor of the MAGA agenda. And this started, I would say, in March of 2016. And Renée tells this story very well in her book. It's a Trending Topics Gate, where Twitter had a very successful trending topics box. Facebook tried to copy that feature. And in order to make sure that there wasn't complete lunacy in the trending topics for any particular category, they had human moderators who were checking what the algorithms would pick out as being the trending topic. And a bunch of Republicans got very mad that this was suppressing.
Very mad. I was in the middle of it all. Yeah.
Well, I'll just say my outside take on this. I'm curious to hear what your inside take was. But on the outside, this was the central debate of the early part of the 2016 election about content moderation. And Republicans made enough of a fuss about it that with a single letter demanding to know, who are you hiring to do your human curation here, and how are you assuring ideological balance, and how can you assure us these are not all San Francisco elite liberals, and so on. Facebook caved, and not unreasonably so, under pressure. I mean, it's understandable why they did, but the reaction or the change that they made to get Republicans off their backs was to remove the human content moderators. So that feature during the critical part of the election was then just done algorithmically and was open to manipulation. And you tell, Renée, very well the story of what that meant concretely for lots of other areas of people's lives, like
I was reading the science section, and like a witch blog that was talking about Mercury in retrograde was the top trending story in science. And I had a friend at Facebook Data Science, and I sent it to him, and I was like, maybe the pure algorithmic thing is just not working.
And that's essentially what happened on politics.
Yep.
And that had a very, very direct political result and helped Trump win the White House. And that is simply an example, but it was the original example that inspired Republicans to continue waging lawfare against private companies to get what they wanted and to work the refs in their favor. That continues, and it will not stop.
And it actually, we don't have to go back, but it actually goes back in history even further with the original Google bombing. And if any of you remember sort of the early 2000s and what happened, not only if you Googled miserable failure, miserable failure, the George W. Bush White House link came up. And then if you Googled Rick Santorum, some very unfortunate websites against the senator and some things that claiming that he liked to do in his private life, it came up on there. And Republicans were very upset. Because
frothing mad.
Yes. And, oh, God. I don't even know how to finish off that. But I think that as we're having this conversation is that there has, since really social media and the internet from the early 2000s, there was always some underground rumblings from Republicans about how platforms were deciding how to rank content that was always sort of underneath the surface, and it would flare up now and then around, like when Santorum was running in 2012, it kind of popped up, when Obama ran in 2008, and a lot of people from the tech industry went to go help Obama run his campaign. There was a lot of that. And then, the trending topics thing really blew it out in the open.
So looking ahead in terms of where we are, Katie, and then we'll go to all of you. So everyone have your questions at the ready. In terms of where we are today, if I'm a social media company or if I'm a university and someone comes to me and says, I want to do research on disinformation, misinformation online, I want to look at what's going up, or if I'm a social media company, I want to do some content moderation, don't I just say, those days are over? That stuff is too hot to handle. We will get sued. We will get denounced. We will get subpoenaed. We're not doing this anymore. So is that where we are?
I think that's where we are with a lot. It's not a universal thing, but yes, the vast majority are in that spot right now of saying that it's just not worth it. But I write a lot about how platforms in particular could try to run from politics, but they can't hide. And so they may be trying to get away from it, but I think it is going to constantly keep catching up to them because people want to talk about, particularly in an election season, they will want to talk about these types of topics, and you can't just completely disengage yourself from it.
So if I can just be a little more concrete about what I think you're saying, you can't run these services without content moderation. That's literally not an option. And if you tried to do it, the services would become a cesspool that people wouldn't want to participate in and that advertisers wouldn't want to advertise on, which is what Twitter is turning into. So that's really not a viable option. What instead Meta has done has been to just basically try to turn off politics. And I think that's what Katie's referring to, that's also very frustrating to people. There's a legal backdrop behind this, which is that there is law now on this. The Digital Services Act in Europe has gone into force. I'll spare you all the details, but the most important part is that it requires the covered large platforms to assess and mitigate their systemic risks. And those systemic risks include dealing with a variety of problematic forms of content, some of which are, things we would all agree are harmful. Some of which, though, are totally undefined, including civic discourse and electoral processes. I don't know what that means, but I know what Donald Trump thinks that interference with electoral processes and civic discourse means, which is just a way of saying that in building these legal responses in Europe, and especially in other countries that are trying to copy Europe, those countries need to be thinking much more carefully about what these legal tools would be used for in the hands of authoritarians who are on the rise in Europe and are certainly in control of the apparatus of government in countries that are copying or purporting to copy the Digital Services Act. So this lawfare, it's not unique to the United States. It's arriving everywhere else around the world. This is just a core part of the culture war that is 21st century politics.
I'm forced to wonder if all of our nice talk about how all the nice things that nice liberals want to do to help clean up the internet environment are now hopelessly out of date because of all these other obstacles, anti-disinformation and so forth. I hope that's not the case, but over to all of you. Wow, we have lots of participation. So everybody, the rules, keep it short, make it a question, not a content, not a comment. And why don't we just start from the very back, the gentleman in the blue shirt in the back row.
Hello, thank you. My name is Daniel. I'm a rising senior at Princeton. So a recent concern with regard to disinformation has been state-sponsored disinformation on non-American platforms like TikTok. Lots of people have talked about that. And of course, the Chinese government has banned Western social media companies, and now some actors in the US are considering banning TikTok over state-sponsored disinformation. But this would seem to pose challenges from the perspective of our liberal and democratic commitments regarding freedom of speech. So both from a legal First Amendment standpoint and from a normative liberal democratic standpoint, what should the appropriate response be from the United States and other liberal democracies with regard to state-sponsored disinformation on companies like TikTok?
Yeah, there's no way I think that the TikTok ban will hold up in court. The only reason anyone thinks that it will is that we have essentially a similar legal framework right now for broadcasting. So, for example, the FCC can limit foreign ownership in broadcasters and can deny licenses and so on. That framework is probably unconstitutional. It has never been challenged. If it were challenged today, it would probably be struck down, even for broadcasting. There's no reason to think that would be valid applied outside of the broadcasting context. So I think that the ban is unconstitutional. I also think that it's illiberal and it validates the Chinese shutdown of other services. So we in the United States shouldn't be doing this. Now, if we were going to do it, if we were going to have some way of dealing with that foreign interference, the way to do it is not to write a bill of attainder that targets a particular company. The way to do it is to have a legal process by which you gather facts about a particular company that is problematic, and you make a law-based decision about that company and what happens to it, right? That at least would be a defensible liberal approach to the problem, which is not what the US Congress has done. The US Congress essentially passed a bill of attainder. So I think that's a terrible thing. And in general, to your more general question about dealing with foreign state-sponsored content, I think if there's a valid approach to dealing with that, it would be labeling sponsorship. And Renée talks about this in her book, so I'll let her weigh in.
One of the interesting pieces with TikTok in particular is that the algorithm is completely opaque. It's the recommender system that's the entire game on that platform, right? It's not, we did a lot of research on it in various elections, and keyword-based search and the sort of things that they surface in their API are not telling the story of what is seen, leading to a lot of papers with differing methodologies and speculative assessments of what's happening on there. This is where Platform Accountability and Transparency Act and other transparency legislation, which does not single out a particular platform, but nonetheless compels them to provide visibility and data access to researchers to interrogate what is actually happening on the platform, is the sort of law I think we can and should pass. Because that would get at that question of what is happening on there, and it would force them to, in a sense, open up and surface a lot more information about how their curation and recommender systems work than they currently do.
Do you want to take a few questions so we can respond?
I'd rather keep them one by one. It's just too hard to gang them up. Let's go to the gentleman with, I think it's a brown jacket, just over there. Two people to your left, Marty.
I think it's a blue jacket, but maybe I'm mistaken.
I can't really see from where I am.
In Europe, this usually takes me longer to say, but here I could probably get away with just saying, remember the main. And every time we have some new kind of information system, we end up with lies, propaganda, rumors, disinfo being spread. And we get calls for censorship. And what we end up working out after a while, whether it's after the Reformation and the 30 Years' War or after World War II, is we don't really need censorship. What we need is editorial capacity. And we built sort of classes of editors who shape the discourse, who decide what gets promoted. And if we were to move away from a model where we tried to take out the bad stuff towards a model where we could find ways to have editors that let in the good, made the good stuff easier to find for people. Good defined very broadly here, but what would people on the panel think would be the best way to do that?
So I've written a ton about that over the years, which is that's the curation game, right? That was so the same way an editor decides what makes it into the pages of a newspaper, what happens on social media is what is in your feed is determined by an algorithm. And there's a lot of interesting work being done now on, rather than engagement-based kind of surfacing of content where something that gets a lot of engagement is the thing that more people see, that incentivizes certain types of behaviors like sensationalism, moral outrage, attacks on another person. There's just reasons why that has structurally happened. But there's some work being done now on what are called bridging algorithms. And I don't want to be too in the weeds here, but it's for anybody interested in that topic, it's worth looking into, which aim to surface disagreement expressed more constructively. So it's not to not surface political content or political topics or important debates that we should be having in the marketplace of ideas. It's just that rather than surfacing the person who's like, look at this horrible person over there, everybody should attack them for their bad woke opinions or their bad anti-woke opinions, what you have instead is content that is surfacing that is elevating the debate, but in ways that seem to be more appealing to parties on both sides, if you will. You see this in community notes too. There's a lot of areas where bridging-based ranking is coming into.
You want to briefly explain how that works?
I feel like that would be way too in the weeds, but but no, it's so what you're trying to do is, for example, with a community note, if community notes on Twitter used to be called Birdwatch. It's actually a very interesting approach. You yourself can go fact check content on the platform in order to prevent brigading in which, let's say, all of the MAGA people support a note, and then the note goes up and it is favorable to their political viewpoints, maybe attacking somebody else. In order for the note to surface, it has to be voted as positive by a sufficient number of users that the algorithm has determined are on opposite sides of an issue or different ideological alignments. Excuse me. And so the idea is that that's going to surface something that is neutral and fact-based. And so you can also, if you don't want to write the notes yourself, you can be a note ranker. I definitely recommend everybody go and look at that. I think it is it enjoys a higher degree of legitimacy because it involves community participation and feedback. And I think that's one of the areas where you're starting to see just much more design-based research on how to use service information better.
Next question. Gentleman in the blue shirt.
Thank you. My name is Ben Ernst. So, Renée, you touched on the structural incentives of these systems.
That's the wonky one.
The structural incentives of these platforms are causing a lot of these problems, right? Ad revenue means they need engagement, means that they optimize for extremism. What can platforms do? What can government do to try to solve that? Is this what users actually want? Or is there a business alternative that would rely on a core structural, different structural business incentives that could eliminate?
Well, I think you're seeing some different experimentation from different platforms of trying to think about that, and you see a lot of discussion. Safety by design, and there's different people who are very much researching that. One of the ways, and I was going to bring this up with the other question as well, is this concept of sort of middleware, right? Where you might give the user more opportunity and more ways to individually curate how you want your feed to be. Because again, everybody in this room, your feeds are all very different depending upon the things that you like. You may have different tolerance levels for different types of content that you're willing to see or not see. And I think one of the things we don't talk enough about as part of this conversation is the role of the user in actually thinking about how you curate your own content as well in these feeds, what you mute or block and what you engage with on that. I think it's still an open question if there's one that can completely change that business model and if we will see it continue to be changed. I think also too that we haven't even talked about AI very much on this panel, and that is also completely going to be changing the game about the incentive structures for people of putting content online and how that appears to people. And I'm going to be very curious to see how that plays out over the next couple of years.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, we should have got to AI, but there's only so much you can do. We've got to hear from Vera de Rugy here near the front.
So I was thinking about when you were talking about community notes, it made me think what is the role of culture in changing all this? Because it seems to me that you can try to figure out the technology, but really ultimately the hard thing to do and the real solution is culture. And you've talked about norms, right? Norms that apply to the platform. So it's a bigger question, but don't we think that all of this is going to be a drop in the ocean if culture doesn't change?
Yeah, I think the problem is the norms are going from online to offline in some ways now. I think the worst, the normalization of harassment, brigading, attacking, attempting to, not argue the facts, but drive your opponent out of the conversation entirely. I think that's really become normalized on social media over the last 9 years. I think you started to see this having, I don't know how many people know what Gamergate is, but this sort of model of online warfare that started in 2015, where people began to realize it's actually highly effective. I don't know how many people paid attention to things like, fights about school board things, COVID, public health, you name it, where the idea that following your local public health official to their car and screaming at them was the way to engage. You started to see that kind of the sort of online harassment mob mentality, I think, started to show up a little bit more in the real world over the last few years. There's some people who are doing real world efforts, because there's a phrase in content moderation, the problem with social media is people, and no matter how much you tweak the tech, ultimately you're fighting human nature at times. And I think that's what you're getting at. And the answer is yes, that's absolutely true. You do the best you can, as Berin notes, otherwise the platforms become unusable. But there's people who are doing work like Better Angels comes to mind, and folks who are trying to diffuse some of the caricatured politics in community that is happening. The question is, can you do that at scale? And I don't know that that's really been solved yet.
What was it that Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, that the great conservative insight was that the culture was more important than politics, but the great liberal insight was that politics shapes culture? I might say the same thing about law, that there are ways in which, for example, the defamation suit that Dominion brought, that had some effect in shaping the culture for the better. Putting someone like Alex Jones out of business does create a disincentive for people to behave like him. Prosecuting the people who showed up at the Capitol on January 6th has probably made it less likely that we're going to have a repeat of that kind of behavior. There is some room here, consistent with the First Amendment, for us to pass laws, especially at the state level, to deal with some of these patterns of harassment and abuse. And I think we're spending much too much time focusing on silver bullet solutions at the federal level that are grossly unconstitutional, and not enough time on this sort of what would you do case by case about individual people who are abusing other people online.
Big takeaway of Renée's book, which, by the way, is a very good book that you all should buy.
And buy it for your mom.
And buy for your mom and all your friends. Goes to both Vera's question and the one before, which is the big takeaway is ultimately the author's sitting here, so I may be about to have a Marshall McLuhan moment. But the big takeaway is this won't be solved by technology. This is going to be solved by the development of norms and institutions that help us better regulate social behavior online. Is that a fair assessment of where
You're supposed to say, you know nothing of my work.
It's great. Thank you.
I was half expecting that. Let's stay up front here and go to this gentleman. Yeah, there's a mic coming.
Hi, Adam Gurray, Liberal Currents. I sort of agree with you that freedom of reach is not a thing. Something I'm curious about is if you think there is some other ideal for which that is, people are groping at with that, similar to the idea of wanting there to be lower barriers to entry in an industry. Do we want, from a marketplace of ideas perspective, to lower the barrier to participation however we can, even if that doesn't mean that we're cracking up Facebook or directly regulating the law?
I feel like the barriers to participation I don't think that there are any at this point. But what do you mean by that? Like, I would say anybody who wants to make a social media account can go and do it on any platform. There are so many. If you'd like to be, a Nazi, there's a platform for that, right? There's a platform for everyone. So no, I think this is another interesting thing that I think I've started writing about it a little bit, like the great decentralization. We had this peak period of like 4 major platforms where it felt like absolutely imperative that you must own the conversation and dominate attention. Now you are starting to see the adoption, the sort of fragmentation, the move to smaller federated platforms, server-based communities, smaller communities, Discords, all these different things where I don't know that it's without consequence. I mean, you're not seeing a ton of across the aisle discourse on some of them, right? They're largely homogenous spaces for people who want to be in them. But that question of like, do you have choices where you can participate? Yes. The challenge is, though, what you see there is that oftentimes we used to joke around about this, that like Truth Social wasn't succeeding because there are no libs to own. Like, that's actually like the audience doesn't want to be there discussing conservative politics with conservatives. They want to be owning their enemies, which is why even though the space is there for them, they leave it, right? It's very interesting because you don't see that happening quite so much now that there are Twitter alternatives where the liberals have gone. So I think watching that decentralization shake out is interesting. But I think ultimately, I see the barrier to entry being 0 at this point. I don't know how it could be lowered.
We're just so good at fighting amongst ourselves.
Gentleman on the aisle in what may be a gray-colored jacket. I don't think it's brown.
Thanks. I think we're also blue, and I'm hoping the mic works because I barely have a voice. It's a question about DSA. To my understanding, DSA is kind of a model of regulating externalities. So looking at misinformation or toxic speech and other issues, externalities that states and the marketplace in the use case have an obligation, but also an interest in regulating. Not eliminating, perhaps, but reducing. So my first question is just, is that an accurate way of understanding, thinking about DSA? Is that an accurate, helpful way to think about regulation more broadly so that we shift out of sort of, in the US context, a First Amendment-based or speech-based focused and more on this as a market issue? So to come to and then the second question, just briefly, was sort of an up-down, because I don't think I heard yet a clear, how do people feel about the DSA? You've raised some definitional issues about things within it, but broadly speaking, is this a good model? I mean, this is the largest democracy, roughly, we'll say, that's really taken a clear regulatory stance and is now undertaking enforcement very actively, as we see this morning, right? So.
Yeah, no, I think your description of the DSA is pretty accurate.
Stands for Digital
Services Act, right? And essentially, the DSA came out of the European response to Trump being deplatformed. At the time, there were a lot of people wringing their hands in Europe about this, saying, well, we didn't like what Trump did on January 6th. We didn't like that content, but surely the private platforms shouldn't be the ones making these decisions, and we should have some kind of framework for governing them. And that's essentially what the DSA aims to be. It leaves to the member states of the European Union the question of what content is unlawful. So unlawful content has to be taken down. It governs the takedown of unlawful content, the process by which that happens, and complaints and transparency governing terms of service violations. It also, as I noted earlier, and this is to your point, it requires platforms to deal with the systemic risks involved in their services. So within the context of European law, where freedom of expression is a right, but it's not a fundamental, it's a fundamental right, but it's not absolute, and it has to be weighed with other rights, and it can be infringed upon if the infringement is proportional. I mean, the DSA makes sense in that context. There are things about it that I would change. There are things about it that I am very concerned about being weaponized in Europe. There are things that are even more concerning if they're copied to countries that don't have the European Union's framework of human rights law and so on. But the most important thing that I would say about the DSA is that by no means could you copy-paste the DSA into the United States. And the reason is not simply the First Amendment, although that is a major reason. The reason is, I'll just tell you, I've been to 3 DSA conferences in the last month. And at every single one of them, the same pattern played out, which is that we would talk again and again about what the DSA says, and what people intended, and how it should be executed. And then I would say, like on day 2 or 3, I would say, but what about the courts and litigation? They would say, oh, yeah, I guess eventually these things will be litigated. Whereas in the United States, that's the first question that you ask. And Alpha, we can talk about this, but there are all sorts of examples of text in the DSA that is not meant to be taken literally. In the United States, not only do we have limits on what the government can do, but we do black letter law. We look at the words on the page and we assume that it's going to be litigated heavily and will be implemented as written. That is simply not how law works in Europe. And it's impossible to do that in a context where you have 27 versions of the text. You don't have a common law system. So in other words, to simplify all this, we can look at the DSA as a model in some respects, but we cannot simply take modules from the DSA off the shelf and drop them into the United States Code.
Who wants to ask the last question? Oh my gosh, this is going to be tough. There is this gentleman on the far reaches here of the left side of the room, in what may or may not be a blue jacket.
You got it that time. Well done. So we spent.
Berin just told me it's brown. I think I'm being gaslighted.
Misinformation. We talked a lot about like how words are conflated. Every word in the title, freedom of speech versus freedom of expression, freedom of reach. What was kind of underpinning a lot of it that we didn't discuss is how some of these tech platforms think of themselves, and we now think of them as, the public square, the town hall, the forum, the agora. So a 2-part question. Have we ever had those things that have worked well, going back to agora and fora? And 2, do we need a digital public square?
I think so. In the 2010 era, sort of like the height of sort of tech utopia, as I kind of call it, you definitely had Twitter and Facebook and others being like, we are the digital town square. Like it was a word that came out of my mouth quite often in trying to talk about why politics, and I was at a time too when the platforms were really leaning into politics because they wanted to be relevant. They wanted to have relevant conversations on their platforms so that people would come to them, choose them over their competitor, et cetera. But that was never really true even then. Of how we defined it, particularly as people started to realize more about the type of curation, content moderation, things that were happening on these. There are folks, New Public and Eli Pariser in particular, are trying to think about what a digital public space might look like, and there's been some experimentations of what that might look like. I think, though, that you are always going to have the challenge that can work well when you have not as many people and they are smaller communities that you can create those, because again, there was never one big global town square. It was usually, right, like in the physical world, it was different size cities or towns, and even within neighborhoods, you had your own things. As you start to get at scale, that becomes a near impossibility in which to have.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
I just have to say, because this is the topic I've spent the last 7 years on. So you might remember Justice Anthony Kennedy, whose opinions often included waxing poetic about the sweet mysteries of life, which prompted Antonin Scalia to declare that he would rather put a bag over his head than have said such highfalutin, essentially non-legal poetry. Right? That's what Anthony Kennedy did, and sometimes it was for the good. Sometimes it was for the bad. And the worst opinion that he ever wrote, in my opinion, is Packingham. So in 2017, North Carolina had a state law that restricted the ability of convicted sex offenders to access digital media. And it was a very simple case. There was clear state action. It was a government law that was restricting the First Amendment rights of users. And that should have been the end of it. And that's all he had to say. And instead, he decided to wax lyrical about the sweet mysteries of life and to call social media, which was the services that these people were being denied access to, the new town square and public forum and so on, right? And at the time, the conservatives on the court, specifically Alito and Thomas, dissented from what they called irresponsible dicta. Dicta being the thing that you say in a court decision that's not binding; it's just a throwaway line. And they warned that this could jeopardize moderation of content that could harm children. Fast forward to the last 7 years ever since. Republicans now have been the ones claiming, these are the new town squares, these are public fora, they're just like shopping malls and airports, and we have a First Amendment right to say whatever we want. Hogwash. That is just not how the First Amendment works. The Supreme Court has effectively said so in the Net Choice case, which effectively clarified that these are not the new public fora, whatever that might mean in some moral sense or some poetic sense. Legally speaking, they're not state actors. So to wrap all this up, is there a public forum, right? If there is, it's the internet itself, right? That's the thing on which anybody can build a service. And if you don't like Twitter, you can build Gab, you can build some other service. That is the platform that makes it possible to build other speech platforms. The private companies that build communities, that curate those communities, that make editorial decisions about what they're going to have in those communities, those are not public fora. Those are like the bars or parades, or pick your analogy. In First Amendment law, they have a right to decide what content they do and don't want to carry. And when they do that, it is not, in a legal sense, censorship.
What an amazing afternoon. Thank you to these incredibly expert panelists. Thank you to all of you for your engagement. I wish we could have gotten to more of you. That is my fault. Above all, the takeaway message of this session: buy Renée's book.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it.